Mr. Carson leaned back in his plush leather chair, his office bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. The skyline stretched before him, but his attention was fixed on the eviction notices stacked neatly on his desk. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as he reviewed the documents with a satisfied smirk. At the top of the pile was a notice addressed to the Johnson family, tenants who had lived in his building for years. "They've been late on rent 3 times this year," he muttered, his tone dismissive. "I've given them enough chances. This time, they're out." His assistant, a young man named Peter, shifted uneasily in the corner. "I heard Mrs. Johnson works 2 jobs," Peter ventured hesitantly, "and her son is doing really well in school. Maybe they just need—" "Spare me the sob stories," Carson interrupted sharply, his voice cold. "This is business, not charity. If they can't keep up, they don't belong here. Besides, I've got bigger plans for that building." Carson's lips curled into a smile as he picked up his phone and dialed a potential buyer. The building, an old but still profitable complex in a bustling neighborhood, was a key piece in his latest deal. Selling it would line his pockets with more cash than he cared to count. The buyer was eager, and Carson was confident the sale would go through smoothly. He glanced at the eviction notice again, already imagining the extra leverage he'd gain with the fewer tenants in the way. "They're just another number," he muttered, almost to himself. "They'll find somewhere else. They always do." On the other end of the line, the buyer confirmed their interest, and Carson ended the call feeling victorious. He leaned forward and signed the eviction notice with a flourish, his pen scratching decisively across the paper. Without sparing another thought for the family he had just displaced, he passed the document to Peter, who hesitated before taking it. "Deliver this first thing tomorrow," Carson ordered. "I don't want any delays." Peter nodded reluctantly and left the office, the weight of the notice heavy in his hands. Carson turned his chair to face the window, his smug expression reflected in the glass. He saw himself as a man in control, a man who always came out on top. Little did he know, the wheels of his perfect plan were already beginning to shift in ways he could never predict. As the city lights flickered on and the sky darkened, Carson poured himself a glass of whiskey, toasting his future success. The Johnsons, he thought, were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Soon they would be gone, and his path to profit would be clear. He never imagined the storm that was quietly brewing, a storm that would upend everything he thought he knew about power, wealth, and justice. In the quiet of his office, he couldn't hear the whispers of change, but they were coming. The day began like any other for Angela Johnson. She rushed through her morning routine, preparing breakfast for her son, Marcus, and helping her elderly mother, Ruth, settle into her favorite armchair before heading to work. The apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of love that made even the worn furniture seem inviting. Angela cherished every corner of their home, despite its flaws. The leaky faucet and creaking floors were minor inconveniences compared to the memories they had built there. Angela was halfway out the door, her work bag slung over her shoulder, when Marcus called out, "Mom, someone's at the door." She paused, frowning. Visitors weren't common, especially not in the middle of the day. She turned back and opened the door to find Peter, the landlord's assistant, standing there with a folded paper in his hands. His face looked strained, and he avoided making direct eye contact. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to give you this," Peter stammered, holding out the document. Angela's heart sank before she even unfolded the paper. Something about Peter's nervous demeanor made her stomach twist. She took the paper and read the bold words at the top. Asterisk, eviction notice, Asterisk. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the world around her seemed to blur. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice trembling as she looked up at Peter. "I've been late a couple of times, but I've always paid. I'm trying my best." Peter shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his shoes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. Mr. Carson says there's nothing he can do. He wants the apartment cleared out by the end of the month." Angela felt tears welling up but blinked them away quickly. She couldn't afford to break down, not now. Behind her, Marcus stepped forward, his young face filled with worry. "What's going on, Mom?" She forced a weak smile for his sake. "It's nothing, baby. Go back inside." Peter mumbled another apology and left, leaving Angela clutching the notice in her trembling hands. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it for support as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The rent had been tough to keep up with, especially after her hours at the diner had been cut. But she'd done everything she could to stay afloat. Now, despite her efforts, they were being forced out of the only home they'd known for years. She walked into the living room, where Ruth was knitting by the window. Marcus sat on the couch, watching her with wide, questioning eyes. Angela took a deep breath and explained the situation as calmly as she could. "They're kicking us out?" Marcus asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "Why? This isn't fair." Ruth placed her knitting down and reached for Angela's hand. Her grip was firm and steady, a stark contrast to Angela's shaking fingers. "We've been through worse," Ruth said, her voice calm and full of quiet strength. "We're not giving up. We'll figure this out." Angela nodded, but the weight of the notice pressed heavily on her chest. She couldn't show her fear in front of Marcus, but deep inside, she was terrified. Where would they go? How could they start over with so little? As the sun set that evening, the warm glow in their apartment seemed to dim. Angela sat at the kitchen table long after Marcus and Ruth had gone to bed. The eviction notice spread out before her. She couldn't shake the landlord's name from her thoughts, Mr. Carson. He didn't know their story, didn't care about their struggles. To him, they were just numbers on a balance sheet. But Angela wasn't ready to let him win. Not yet. The night after receiving the eviction notice, Angela barely slept. She sat by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea, staring into the dark streets below. The city was alive with its usual sounds, distant sirens, muffled voices, the occasional hum of a passing car. But to Angela, it felt eerily quiet. Every plan she thought of crumbled as soon as it formed in her mind. Finding a new apartment on such short notice seemed impossible. Their savings were thin, stretched by months of rent payments, bills, and groceries, and moving costs alone felt like an insurmountable mountain. In the morning, Ruth found her still sitting there. The older woman placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her grip both comforting and commanding. "Angela," Ruth said firmly, "you fought too hard to give up now. We'll find a way. We always do." Angela sighed deeply, a mix of exhaustion and determination brewing inside her. "It's not just about finding a place, Mom. It's everything. I've worked so hard, but it's never enough. Marcus deserves better. You deserve better. And now this." She gestured to the crumpled eviction notice on the counter. "It feels like the world's stacked against us." Ruth leaned against the counter, her face calm but her eyes fierce. "Do you remember when your father lost his job? We had nothing, Angela, nothing but each other. And we made it through. You're stronger than you think. You always have been." Those words planted a seed in Angela's heart. She wasn't sure what their next step would be, but she couldn't afford to let despair win. That morning, after dropping Marcus off at school, Angela took her first step toward fighting back. She visited the local tenants' rights office, a cramped but bustling space filled with people seeking help. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, handed her a pamphlet about eviction laws. "Your landlord has a history," the receptionist said, lowering her voice slightly. "You're not the first tenant he's pushed out. He's been fined before for cutting corners on repairs and forcing people out to raise rents." Angela's ears perked up. "He's done this to other families?" The woman nodded. "Plenty. If you want, you can talk to one of our attorneys. They might be able to buy you some time." Angela left the office with a spark of hope. If she could delay the eviction, even by a few weeks, it would give her time to figure out her next move. But deep down, she knew that buying time wasn't enough. She needed a permanent solution. The thought gnawed at her all afternoon, even as she waited tables at the diner. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Angela broke the news to Marcus and Ruth about what she had learned. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since the notice arrived, spoke up. "So, he's just doing this to make more money? Doesn't he care about the people who live here?" Angela shook her head, her expression grim. "People like Mr. Carson don't see people, baby. They see dollar signs." "Then we need to show him we're not just going to roll over," Marcus said, his young voice filled with a determination that surprised both Angela and Ruth. "We have to do something." Ruth smiled proudly at her grandson. "That's the spirit," she said. "Angela, what's the plan?" Angela hesitated, the weight of responsibility pressing on her. But then she remembered the receptionist's words about Carson's history and the fines he'd faced. "First, we buy time," she said finally. "I'll meet with an attorney tomorrow. If he's breaking the law, we'll make him pay for it. And maybe, just maybe, we can turn this around." That night, Angela sat down with a pen and paper, listing every resource and connection she could think of. It wasn't much: a co-worker who used to work in real estate, a neighbor who mentioned knowing someone at the bank, and her distant cousin who had experience with legal paperwork. But it was a start. Meanwhile, Marcus began doing his own research, combing through the internet for anything he could find on tenant rights and landlord laws. Ruth, ever the matriarch, made a pot of tea and offered quiet words of encouragement. Together, they began to form a plan, a fragile but hopeful outline of how they might fight back. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, Angela felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. She knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Mr. Carson had power, money, and connections on his side. But Angela had something stronger: a family that refused to give up, a community that might stand with her, and a growing fire in her heart to prove that they were worth more than the paper he had so carelessly signed. As the city lights twinkled outside their window, Angela closed her eyes and whispered a quiet promise to herself: "We won't go down without a fight." While the Johnsons quietly worked on their plan, Mr. Carson moved through his world of comfort and power with an air of unshakable confidence. His mornings began in his corner office, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup while admiring the view of the city below. To him, the eviction of the Johnson family was just another routine task, a step toward making his building more profitable. Carson rarely visited the building he owned. He didn't see the peeling paint in the hallways or hear the frustrated voices of tenants discussing broken heaters and rising rents. In his mind, the place was an asset, a number on a spreadsheet, not a home to real people. He had bigger concerns, like negotiating the sale of the property to an eager developer who had promised him a hefty payout. The deal, he thought, was practically sealed. The developer, a sharp-suited man named Mr. Ellis, had shown keen interest in the building's prime location. Carson played it cool during their meetings, feigning patience while subtly pushing Ellis to close the deal. "You're not the only one interested in this property," Carson said during their latest call, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "But since you've been persistent, I might consider giving you a better rate, if we can finalize things quickly." Ellis chuckled. "You drive a hard bargain, Carson, but I like your style. Let's meet next week to finalize the paperwork." Carson hung up, grinning to himself. Everything was falling into place. By the time the Johnsons were out, the building would be ready for its transformation. A sleek, high-end apartment complex catering to wealthier tenants. He imagined the increased rent rolls, the shiny advertisements boasting luxury living, and the compliments he'd receive from his peers in the real estate world. To celebrate his impending victory, Carson decided to stop by the building for a brief inspection. It was rare for him to visit in person, but he figured it might be satisfying to see the progress he'd made toward clearing out the undesirable tenants. Dressed in his tailored suit and polished shoes, he arrived at the property late in the afternoon, drawing curious stares from the tenants who rarely saw their landlord. As he walked through the building, he was greeted with the sight of peeling wallpaper and scuffed floors. He barely noticed. What did catch his attention, however, was a group of tenants gathered near the stairwell, whispering and throwing furtive glances in his direction. Carson frowned, but he didn't stop to investigate. Tenants gossiping was nothing new. They always had complaints. What mattered was that soon their voices wouldn't be his problem anymore. Carson's tour of the building ended with a visit to the Johnsons' apartment. He stood outside their door for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of voices inside. The idea of Angela Johnson pleading for more time crossed his mind, but it didn't bother him. In his eyes, she and her family had already lost. "Tick-tock," he muttered under his breath, smirking as he turned to leave. "Time's running out." What Carson didn't realize was that his confidence had blinded him to the quiet storm brewing around him. Angela's visit to the tenants' rights office had sparked more than just hope for her family. She had learned about Carson's long history of exploiting tenants and cutting corners, and she wasn't alone. Other tenants, emboldened by her determination, began to share their own stories. Broken promises, unsafe living conditions, unfair rent hikes, all of it started coming to light. Carson's hubris made him oblivious to the whispers of discontent spreading through his building. He didn't see the tenants exchanging phone numbers or the quiet meetings held in Angela's apartment. To him, they were just a group of powerless renters with no means to challenge him. But Angela knew better. She knew that people, when united by a shared cause, could be far more powerful than they seemed. As Carson returned to his luxurious office that evening, still basking in his perceived victory, he had no idea that the foundation of his carefully constructed empire was beginning to crack. The tenants he dismissed as insignificant were finding their voices, and Angela Johnson was leading the charge. Unbeknownst to Carson, the Johnsons weren't preparing to move out. They were preparing for something far bigger, a fight that would change everything. Back in her apartment, Angela felt a shift in the air as the seeds of resistance began to take root. Her visit to the tenants' rights office had opened her eyes to the power of collective action, and as she shared what she had learned with her neighbors, she realized they all carried similar stories. The broken promises, unlivable conditions, and Carson's callous disregard for the people who called his building home had left a bitter taste in everyone's mouths. What had once been whispered frustrations in hallways began to emerge as a shared anger, one that Angela knew could be turned into action. The following evening, Angela hosted a small meeting in her apartment. It started with just a few neighbors, Mrs. Lopez from down the hall, who had been fighting mold in her bathroom for years, Mr. and Mrs. Patel, who had endured multiple rent hikes despite never seeing any improvements, and a young college student, Jamal, who lived in one of the cheapest units but dealt with constant plumbing issues. Each person came with their own frustrations and doubts. "Why bother?" Mrs. Lopez said, shaking her head. "Carson has money, lawyers, and power. What do we have?" Angela looked around the room, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We have each other," she said firmly. "I know it's scary. I know it feels like we can't win. But if we don't stand up now, he'll keep doing this, to us and to anyone else who moves in after us." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was only silence. Then Jamal spoke up. "She's right," he said. "We've all been putting up with this for too long. If we come together, maybe we can actually do something." One by one, the others began to nod. By the end of the night, they had a plan. Angela, with her newfound knowledge, helped draft a formal letter outlining their grievances, which they all signed. The letter demanded immediate attention to the building's numerous issues and included a warning. If Carson didn't address their concerns, they would file a formal complaint with the housing authority. The letter was just the beginning. Angela also encouraged the tenants to start documenting everything: broken fixtures, unaddressed repairs, unexplained fees, and to take photos and videos as evidence. She reached out to the tenants' rights office again and found an attorney willing to offer advice. Slowly but surely, the tenants began to feel a spark of hope. They weren't just individuals fighting their own battles anymore. They were a united front. But Angela didn't stop there. She knew that standing up to Carson required more than just complaints. She needed leverage. Late one night, as Marcus sat at the dining table working on homework, Angela flipped through the file of documents she'd collected from the tenants' rights office. That's when she found it. A record of Carson's previous fines and legal troubles. He had been cited multiple times for code violations in other properties he owned, and, in some cases, tenants had been forced to move out because of unsafe conditions. The pattern was clear. Carson's greed often left him cutting corners, and it had already cost him in the past. Angela leaned back in her chair, a plan forming in her mind. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she was going to use this information to turn the tables on him. As she looked up from the papers, she noticed Marcus watching her. "What's all that?" he asked curiously. "Just a little research," Angela said with a small smile. "We're going to make sure Mr. Carson regrets ever messing with this building." Marcus grinned. "You mean like a secret mission?" "Something like that," Angela replied, ruffling his hair. "But don't tell anyone yet. We've got to be smart about this." As the days passed, Angela's determination only grew. Word of the tenants' efforts began to spread, and more people joined their meetings. Even those who were skeptical at first started to see the possibility of change. The atmosphere in the building shifted. The fear and resignation that had once filled the halls were replaced by quiet defiance and whispered plans. Meanwhile, Carson remained blissfully unaware. He continued his routine as if nothing had changed, still confident that the eviction notices and pending sale would proceed without a hitch. But Angela knew better. She knew that their growing resistance was like a storm gathering strength, ready to unleash when the time was right. And she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop them. Angela's letter, signed by the tenants, was delivered to Mr. Carson's office by courier on a rainy morning. Carson was midway through reviewing paperwork for his upcoming sale when the envelope was placed on his desk. He opened it absent-mindedly, expecting a routine request or perhaps another notice about minor building issues. However, as his eyes scanned the carefully worded document, his jaw tightened. The letter detailed a litany of complaints, from years of ignored repairs to unfair rent increases. It was accompanied by photographs of leaking ceilings, cracked walls, and broken fixtures. Worst of all, it included a pointed reminder of Carson's past fines for neglect and a warning that if these issues weren't addressed immediately, the tenants would escalate their complaints to the housing authority and local media. Carson's face flushed with anger. "Who do these people think they are?" he muttered, slamming the letter down. "They're tenants, not shareholders. They live in my building, under my rules." Peter, his assistant, stood nervously by the door. "It seems like they're organizing, sir," he said cautiously. "They've been meeting in the Johnsons' apartment. I think Angela Johnson might be leading them." Carson's expression darkened. "Angela Johnson," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a curse. "That woman thinks she can threaten me? We'll see about that." Despite his bluster, Carson couldn't entirely dismiss the letter. It wasn't the complaints that concerned him. He had dealt with angry tenants before and always found a way to shut them down. But the mention of escalating to housing authorities and the media made him uneasy. His reputation in the real estate world was carefully cultivated, and bad press could jeopardize the sale of the building. Ellis, the developer, was already a cautious buyer. If word got out that the building had unresolved legal and structural issues, the deal could fall apart. Carson spent the rest of the morning making calls, starting with his lawyer. "It's nothing I can't handle," he assured himself as he explained the situation. "They're just trying to cause trouble because they don't want to leave. I'll file a countersuit for noncompliance or something. That'll scare them into backing down." But as the day wore on, Carson found himself growing more irritated. He instructed Peter to deliver stern warnings to a few tenants who had signed the letter, hinting at consequences if they didn't fall back in line. "Make it clear that I'm still the one in charge," he ordered. Peter hesitated. "But what about Angela Johnson? She seems persistent." Carson waved a dismissive hand. "Persistence doesn't pay the bills. She's just another tenant with no real power. She'll fold just like the rest of them." Meanwhile, in the Johnsons' apartment, Angela sat with Jamal and Mrs. Lopez, reviewing their next steps. The letter had been sent, but they all knew it was just the beginning. "He'll push back," Angela said, her tone steady but firm. "He's not going to take this line down. But neither are we." The atmosphere was tense but determined. Jamal had spent the past few days researching Carson's properties online and had uncovered even more violations from his past. "This guy has a pattern," he said, showing Angela the articles on his laptop. "He gets away with it because people don't fight back. We can use this to our advantage." Angela nodded, her mind racing. She could feel the pressure mounting. Carson wouldn't let them win easily, but the growing unity among the tenants gave her strength. "We need to document everything," she said. "Not just the problems in the building, but whatever he does next. If he tries to intimidate us, we'll have proof." Just as she finished speaking, there was a knock at the door. Angela exchanged a wary glance with Jamal before standing to answer it. Peter stood on the other side, looking uncomfortable as he handed her a folded letter. "Mr. Carson wanted you to have this," he said awkwardly, "and he wanted me to remind you that he's not someone you want to challenge." Angela unfolded the letter as Peter walked away, her heart pounding. The message was short and pointed. Asterisk, cease your complaints immediately, or face legal action. Beneath the typed words was Carson's signature, bold and unmistakable. For a moment, Angela felt the weight of the threat pressing down on her. Legal action could mean court costs, endless paperwork, and months of stress. But then she looked around her apartment at Jamal, Mrs. Lopez, and Marcus, who had just returned from school and was watching her anxiously. She realized that giving up wasn't an option. She set the letter down calmly. "If he thinks this is going to scare us, he doesn't know who he's dealing with," she said, her voice steady. "We're just getting started." Carson had underestimated her resolve. What he saw as a small rebellion was quickly turning into a full-scale resistance, and Angela was more determined than ever to show him just how much power ordinary people could have when they stood together. The tension in the building was palpable in the days following Carson's warning. Angela, with the letter still fresh in her mind, felt the weight of her decision to keep fighting. Every knock at the door made her heart race, and every whispered conversation in the hallways seemed filled with urgency. But instead of fear, she saw determination in the faces of her neighbors. It was as if Carson's threats had only strengthened their resolve. The tenants' meetings, once small and cautious, began to grow. Word spread quickly, and soon even the tenants who had been hesitant to get involved began attending. Angela became the unspoken leader, guiding them with a calm but fierce determination. She listened to their grievances, coordinated their actions, and ensured everyone felt heard. One evening, the group gathered in Jamal's apartment, which had become their unofficial headquarters. It was cramped with mismatched furniture and stacks of textbooks, but it felt safe, like a war room for a group of underdogs preparing for battle. Angela stood at the front, a large piece of paper taped to the wall behind her, listing their goals and strategies. "Here's what we know," Angela began, pointing to the list. "Carson has a history of pushing tenants out illegally. He's been fined before, but he's never faced real consequences. That ends now. We've got the proof, we've got the witnesses, and now we need to make sure people outside this building know what's happening." Jamal raised his hand, holding up his phone. "I've been talking to a journalist I know from school. She's interested in doing a story about landlords like Carson. Slumlords, she called them. If we can get her in here to see the conditions and hear our stories, it could blow this thing wide open." The room buzzed with excitement. For the first time, they saw a way to fight back on a larger scale. Angela smiled at Jamal. "That's a great start. Let's set it up." Meanwhile, Marcus had been working on his own. Inspired by his mom's determination, he started collecting signatures from tenants who couldn't attend the meetings, explaining their cause and encouraging them to stand with the group. He carried his clipboard through the building every afternoon after school, knocking on doors and talking to neighbors. At first, some were skeptical. "What's the point?" an elderly man asked him one day. "Landlords like Carson always win." Marcus stood tall, his voice steady. "Not if we stand together," he said. "My mom says we're stronger as a group. She's right. We don't have to let him win." The man hesitated, then signed the paper. Slowly but surely, Marcus gathered support, adding to the growing sense of unity in the building. But Carson wasn't blind to what was happening. Reports from Peter and his other staff began to paint a picture of growing unrest among the tenants. He dismissed it at first, certain they would back down eventually, but as the complaints piled up and rumors of media involvement reached his ears, his confidence started to waver. One day, as he sat in his office reviewing paperwork for the sale, his phone rang. It was Ellis, the developer. Carson answered with his usual charm, but Ellis's tone was clipped. "I'm hearing some troubling things about your building," Ellis said bluntly. "Tenant complaints, potential legal action, even talk of a news story. I don't like surprises, Carson." Carson's stomach tightened. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "A few disgruntled tenants trying to stir up trouble. It won't affect the sale." "Let's hope not," Ellis replied. "But if this becomes a public issue, I'll have to reconsider. I don't buy buildings with bad press attached." The line went dead, leaving Carson gripping the phone in frustration. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Could these tenants really threaten his plans? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. They were just tenants, he reminded himself, people without the money or power to take him on. But as the days passed, the cracks in his confidence began to deepen. The tenants weren't backing down. Instead, they seemed more organized, more determined, and more united than he had ever expected. And Angela Johnson, the woman he had dismissed as just another renter, was proven to be a far greater adversary than he had anticipated. Carson didn't realize it yet, but the tide was already turning against him. The tenants had found their voice, and Angela was about to ensure it was heard far beyond the walls of the building. Angela's resolve deepened as the days wore on. The meetings in Jamal's apartment had become a hub of action. Notes, photos, and legal documents covered the small table in the center of the room, while discussions buzzed about their next moves. But the stakes grew higher with every step they took, and Angela knew it was time to bring their fight to the public. Jamal's journalist friend, Lila Martinez arrived at the building on a brisk afternoon. She was a sharp, determined young woman with a keen eye for injustice and a knack for telling stories that resonated with readers. Angela met her at the front steps, welcoming her with a firm handshake and a calm, confident demeanor that masked her nervous energy. "I want you to see everything," Angela said, leading Lila through the building. "Not just the broken pipes and the peeling paint, but the people behind these walls. That's what Carson doesn't understand. We're not just names on a lease." Lila followed Angela through the hallways, taking notes and snapping pictures. She interviewed tenants like Mrs. Lopez, who showed her the mold creeping up her bathroom walls, and Jamal, who described the plumbing issues that flooded his kitchen every few months. Each story painted a vivid picture of neglect and exploitation, a stark contrast to the image Carson likely wanted to project to his buyers. "What about you?" Lila asked Angela as they stood outside her apartment. "Why are you leading this fight?" Angela hesitated for a moment, then said, "Because someone has to. Carson thinks he can take everything from us, but this building isn't just where we live. It's our home, and I'm not going to let him destroy that." By the time Lila left, her notebook was full and her camera brimmed with evidence. She promised to publish the story by the end of the week, giving the tenants a powerful platform to share their experiences. Angela felt a mix of hope and anxiety. The fight was about to reach a wider audience, but with that came greater risks. Across town, Carson sat in his office stewing over the latest updates from Peter. The tenants' unity had grown beyond his control, and the media involvement was a threat he hadn't anticipated. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling slightly in his glass as his irritation mounted. "These people don't know who they're dealing with," he muttered, pacing his office. "A story in the paper won't change anything. I own that building, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect my investment." But his bravado couldn't mask the gnawing doubt in his mind. He had already heard whispers from Ellis, the developer, who was growing increasingly concerned about the tenants' uprising. If the deal fell through, Carson would not only lose the sale but also risk a financial hit he couldn't easily recover from. To counter the growing resistance, Carson decided to take matters into his own hands. He instructed Peter to send notices to tenants who had joined Angela's cause, threatening them with fines for minor infractions, unauthorized decorations, late trash removal, or even noise complaints fabricated by Carson himself. His goal was simple: scare them into submission. The tenants were furious when the notices arrived. At the next meeting, the group debated their next move. "He's trying to intimidate us," Jamal said, holding up his letter. "We can't let him win." Angela stood at the head of the room, her expression calm but her voice resolute. "This is exactly what he wants, to make us afraid, to make us think we can't fight back. But we have proof of what he's doing, and now we have the press on our side. Let him send as many letters as he wants. We're not backing down." Her words lit a fire in the room. The tenants agreed to stay united, each promising to document every interaction and keep pushing forward. Lila's story, Angela reminded them, could be the turning point they needed. When the article went live a few days later, it spread faster than Angela could have imagined. The headline was bold and damning. "Tenants Fight Back. Slumlords Neglect Exposed in Spirited Uprising." The story detailed years of Carson's mismanagement, shining a spotlight on the tenants' fight for justice. Photos of the building's disrepair and quotes from Angela and others made it impossible to ignore. The impact was immediate. Local housing authorities began investigating, and community organizations reached out, offering support to the tenants. Even Carson's developer, Ellis, called to express his frustration. "I'm not buying into a public relations nightmare," Ellis said bluntly. "Clean this up, Carson, or the deal is off." For the first time, Carson felt his control slipping away. The tenants weren't just a minor inconvenience anymore. They were a real threat. And Angela Johnson, the woman he had so easily dismissed, was now at the center of a movement that was rapidly gaining momentum. The article hit Carson like a storm he hadn't seen coming. The words slumlord and neglect stared back at him from the newspaper on his desk, while the accompanying photos of peeling walls and leaking ceilings only deepened his frustration. Calls from associates flooded in all day. Lawyers, business partners, and even a few potential buyers who had been considering other properties Carson owned. Each conversation only confirmed what he feared. His reputation was unraveling, and fast. Ellis, the developer interested in the building, was the loudest critic. "This article isn't just bad press, Carson," Ellis said during a heated phone call. "It's a deal breaker. If this doesn't get resolved immediately, I'm walking." Carson gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm handling it," he snapped. "Give me a week, and you'll see everything back under control." "Fix it, Carson," Ellis warned before hanging up. Carson slammed the phone down, rage bubbling beneath his composed exterior. He refused to let a group of tenants destroy the deal he had spent months orchestrating. To him, this wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. Angela Johnson had made it personal. That evening, Carson devised a plan to regain control. He called an emergency meeting with his legal team and instructed them to draw up eviction notices for anyone who had signed Angela's petition. "If they want to play hardball, we'll play harder," he said coldly. "Every one of them is replaceable." His lawyer, an older man with a weary expression, hesitated. "Carson, if you push them too hard, you could face retaliation. You're already under scrutiny from housing authorities because of that article." "I'm not paying you to worry about retaliation," Carson growled. "I'm paying you to get results. Make it happen." By morning, notices were delivered to several tenants, including Jamal, Mrs. Lopez, and the Patels. Angela's apartment, however, received the most direct message, a letter threatening immediate legal action for organizing an unauthorized tenant group, along with a warning that failing to disband the meetings would result in eviction. Angela read the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She had expected pushback from Carson, but the blatant aggression still rattled her. For a moment, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the words as doubt crept in. Was she putting her family at risk? Could they really take on someone as powerful as Carson? Her mother, Ruth, noticed her unease and came to sit beside her. "What's wrong, Angie?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. Angela handed her the letter. Ruth read it quietly, her expression hardening. "He's scared," she said firmly. "That's why he's doing this. He knows you're winning." Angela looked at her mother, surprised by her confidence. "Winning? It doesn't feel like it." "It never does when you're in the thick of it," Ruth replied. "But look at what you've done, Angela. You've brought people together. You've made him nervous enough to lash out. That means you're doing something right." Ruth's words lit a spark in Angela. She couldn't back down now, not when the tenants were counting on her, and not when Carson's fear was starting to show. She called Jamal and asked him to organize an emergency meeting that evening. "We need to show him we're not afraid," she said. "If he thinks these letters are going to stop us, he's in for a surprise." That night, the largest tenant meeting yet took place in Jamal's apartment. Nearly every resident in the building crammed into the small space, their frustration and determination palpable. Angela stood at the center, holding up her letter for all to see. "This is what Carson thinks of us," she began, her voice strong despite the tension in the room. "He thinks he can scare us into silence with threats and legal jargon, but he doesn't realize who he's dealing with. We're not just tenants, we're a community, and we're not going anywhere." Cheers erupted from the group, and Angela continued laying out their next steps. They would file formal complaints against Carson with the housing authority, organize a public rally to draw more attention to their cause, and contact local legal aid groups to prepare for the possibility of court battles. Angela also encouraged everyone to keep documenting everything: letters, interactions, and any retaliation they faced. As the meeting ended, the mood in the room was electric. The tenants left with renewed energy, ready to take the fight to the next level. Angela stayed behind for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. Jamal approached her, his expression serious. "You really think we can beat him?" he asked quietly. Angela smiled, her confidence unwavering. "We already are." Unbeknownst to her, Carson was preparing his next move, a move that would escalate the fight in ways neither side could have anticipated. Carson sat in his dimly lit office late into the night, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of a wall clock. The pressure was mounting, and, for the first time, he felt cornered. The tenant's complaints had reached the housing authority, and he had been summoned for an official inspection of the building. Worse yet, whispers of the upcoming rally organized by Angela and the tenants had begun circulating in the local media. His carefully crafted reputation was unraveling, and with it, the lucrative sale to Ellis seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Carson poured himself a drink, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. He couldn't let them win. Losing control of this building would be more than just a financial blow. It would be a humiliation he couldn't afford. Desperation began to cloud his judgment, leading him to consider options he would have dismissed before. The following day, Carson put his plan into motion. He called in a favor from a private investigator, a shrewd and morally ambiguous man named Rayner. "I need dirt on Angela Johnson," Carson said bluntly. "Something I can use to discredit her. Anything. Financial trouble, a criminal record, unpaid bills. I don't care what it is, just find it." Rayner raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a sly smile. "Desperate times, huh? Don't worry, Carson. Everyone has skeletons. I'll find hers." Meanwhile, Angela and the tenants were making final preparations for their rally, which was scheduled to take place in front of the building that weekend. Flyers had been printed, signs were being painted, and local activists had agreed to join in support. The sense of unity among the tenants was stronger than ever, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Carson wouldn't go down without a fight. Her instincts proved correct later that evening when she received an unexpected visit from Peter. He stood at her doorstep, looking more uneasy than ever, clutching a small envelope in his hands. "I shouldn't be here," Peter said quickly, his eyes darting around as if he expected Carson to appear at any moment. "But I can't keep watching what he's doing. This is too far." Angela frowned, taking the envelope from him. "What is this?" "It's a copy of the report he ordered on you," Peter whispered. "He's digging into your past, looking for anything he can use to make you look bad. Be careful, Angela. He's not playing fair anymore." Angela's stomach turned as she opened the envelope. Inside was a summary of her financial history, including late payments on medical bills from years ago when Marcus was born. There were also notes about a small legal dispute she had been involved in over a parking ticket. It was nothing scandalous, but Carson clearly intended to spin it into something damaging. "This is low," Angela muttered, anger rising in her chest, "even for him." Peter nodded. "I know, but I thought you should know what you're up against." "Thank you," Angela said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'll handle it." After Peter left, Angela sat down with Ruth and Jamal to discuss what had happened. Jamal was furious, slamming his hand on the table. "He's trying to destroy your reputation. That's how he thinks he'll win." Ruth, however, was calm, her expression unreadable. "Let him dig," she said simply. "What matters isn't what he finds. It's how you respond." Angela nodded, her mother's words grounding her. "He's trying to make me look weak, to make people doubt me," she said. "But we'll turn this against him. If he wants to attack me, I'll show him I'm not afraid." As the rally approached, Carson received the results of Rayner's investigation. The report wasn't as damning as he'd hoped, but it would have to do. Carson crafted a press release accusing Angela of financial irresponsibility and framing her as someone unfit to lead a tenant movement. He sent the release to several local news outlets, hoping to tarnish her credibility before the rally could gain traction. The smear campaign landed the next morning. Angela woke up to find her name splashed across local blogs and social media, accompanied by sensational headlines like "Tenant Leader Exposed," troubled past comes to light. The article twisted her medical debt into a narrative of poor judgment and implied that her previous legal dispute was evidence of a pattern of dishonesty. Angela felt a pang of anxiety as she scrolled through the articles, but she quickly steeled herself. She knew the truth, and so did the tenants. Carson's attack was nothing more than a desperate attempt to shift the narrative. "We need to get ahead of this," Jamal said as they gathered in her apartment that afternoon. "He's trying to paint you as the bad guy." Angela nodded. "Then we show them the real story. I'll address it at the rally. Let them hear the truth from me." The rally day arrived with a clear sky and a buzz of energy. Dozens of tenants, activists, and supporters gathered in front of the building, holding signs that read, "Homes over profit," and "Stop Carson's greed." Angela stood at the front of the crowd, her nerves tightly wound but her determination stronger than ever. As cameras flashed and reporters began asking questions, Angela took the microphone. She spoke with clarity and passion, addressing not only the issues in the building but also Carson's attempt to smear her. "Yes, I've struggled," she said, her voice unwavering. "Like so many of us, I've faced hardships and made sacrifices to provide for my family. But those struggles don't make me weak. They make me strong. They make me understand what this fight is about: protecting our homes, our families, and our dignity." The crowd erupted into applause, and Angela felt a surge of confidence. Carson's smear campaign had failed to silence her. If anything, it had only made her voice louder. But she knew this was far from the end. Carson's next move would likely be his most desperate yet, and Angela was ready for it. The rally was a resounding success. Angela's speech spread quickly across social media, amplified by local activists and sympathetic reporters. Her words struck a chord not only with the tenants of Carson's building, but also with people across the city who had faced similar struggles with exploitative landlords. Photos and videos of the crowd holding signs and chanting slogans like "Justice for Tenants" began trending, and Angela found herself at the center of a growing movement. For the first time, Carson's name wasn't just a whisper among tenants. It was being shouted from podiums and shared across the internet. The pressure on him intensified as housing authorities announced they would accelerate their inspection of the building, citing concerns raised by the rally and the damning media coverage. Carson's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from Ellis, his lawyer, and other associates, all demanding answers. "This has gone too far," Ellis barked during one particularly heated call. "You were supposed to keep this quiet. Now your name is a liability. If this mess isn't resolved by the end of the week, I'm pulling out of the deal." Carson clenched his fists, his carefully constructed world unraveling by the second. He had spent years building his reputation, crafting an image of success and control. Now, Angela Johnson and her band of tenants were tearing it all apart. He refused to let them win. At the same time, Angela returned to her apartment after the rally, physically exhausted but emotionally charged. She had spent hours speaking to reporters, shaking hands with supporters, and answering questions from fellow tenants. The overwhelming show of solidarity left her hopeful, but she knew the fight wasn't over. As she sat at her kitchen table with Jamal, Marcus, and Ruth, the adrenaline of the day began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. "He's going to come back harder after this," Angela said, glancing at the latest news articles on her phone. "We hit him where it hurts, and now he's going to retaliate." Jamal nodded. "You're right, but we're stronger now. Look at the turnout today. People are listening to us." Ruth poured a cup of tea, her calm presence anchoring the room. "Let him retaliate," she said firmly. "Every move he makes digs his hole deeper. Just keep doing what you're doing, standing tall and telling the truth." Angela smiled at her mother's quiet wisdom. Despite her worries, she felt a sense of clarity. Carson's desperation was a sign that their efforts were working. They had forced him into a corner, and now he was showing his true colors. True to Angela's prediction, Carson's retaliation came swiftly. 2 days after the rally, tenants began receiving notices of eviction for what Carson claimed were violations of their leases. Angela's notice arrived late in the evening, delivered by a nervous Peter, who apologized profusely as he handed it to her. "It's not just you," Peter said quietly. "He's targeting everyone who spoke at the rally. He's calling it a breach of contract and saying the meetings are against the lease agreement." Angela unfolded the notice, her jaw tightening as she read the baseless accusations. She knew Carson was grasping at straws, but the stakes had just been raised. If these evictions went through, dozens of families would be forced out of their homes, and Carson would achieve his goal of clearing the building for sale. "This is it," Angela said, her voice steady but fierce. "He's trying to break us, but we're not going to let him." The next morning, Angela contacted the tenants' rights attorney who had been advising them. Together, they crafted a response to Carson's legal threats, filing a counterclaim accusing him of retaliatory eviction and harassment. The tenants also decided to escalate their efforts, organizing a sit-in at the building to draw even more attention to their cause. As word spread of the evictions and the tenants' response, the story gained even more traction in the media. Local politicians began weighing in, some expressing support for the tenants and others calling for a full investigation into Carson's business practices. Angela's name became synonymous with the fight for tenant rights, and she found herself receiving calls from activists and organizations across the city, all offering their help. Carson watched the growing chaos with a sinking feeling in his chest. Every move he made seemed to backfire, pushing the tenants closer together and drawing more attention to their cause. He couldn't stop the housing authority's investigation, which had already uncovered several code violations in the building. Ellis, true to his word, had grown impatient, and Carson knew the deal was on the verge of collapse. For the first time, Carson began to feel the weight of defeat pressing down on him. His empire, once untouchable, was crumbling around him. And Angela Johnson, the tenant he had dismissed as insignificant, was standing at the center of it all, unshaken and unstoppable. But Carson wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had one final move left, one that he hoped would end the fight once and for all. What he didn't realize was that his desperation would only bring him closer to the moment he had been dreading, the moment he realized he had already lost. Carson sat alone in his office, the silence deafening. His once pristine desk was now cluttered with papers, legal notices, complaints from tenants, emails from his lawyer warning him of potential lawsuits. The media coverage had turned public opinion against him, and his name was no longer associated with power and success, but with greed and neglect. For the first time, Carson felt cornered. The phone on his desk buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Ellis. Carson picked up, trying to muster his usual confidence. "Carson, I've had enough," Ellis said sharply. "The deal is off. Your building is a mess. Your tenants are in open revolt. I can't risk my reputation being dragged down with yours." "Wait," Carson pleaded, his voice uncharacteristically desperate. "I can fix this. Give me a week. I'll clear out the troublemakers and have everything back on track." "It's too late," Ellis replied coldly. "This isn't just bad press anymore. The housing authorities are involved, and there's talk of criminal negligence. I'm out." The call ended abruptly, leaving Carson gripping the phone in frustration. His chest tightened as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The deal that had promised him a fortune was gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. But Carson wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Determined to salvage what he could, Carson decided to take the most drastic measure yet. He called in a team of contractors and instructed them to begin repairs on the building immediately. He hoped the gesture would appease the housing authorities and buy him some goodwill with the public. But Carson's intentions weren't entirely noble. He also hoped the construction chaos would make life unbearable for the tenants, forcing them to leave. The next morning, the building was alive with the sounds of hammering and drilling. Walls were torn down, pipes were replaced, and the hallways were cluttered with debris. The tenants, already frustrated by Carson's intimidation tactics, were now faced with the additional stress of living in a construction zone. Angela, however, saw through Carson's plan. As she stepped over piles of rubble on her way to the stairwell, she knew this wasn't about improving the building. It was about pushing them out. "He's trying to make us miserable," Angela said during an impromptu meeting in her apartment that evening. "But we're not going anywhere. If anything, this proves he's scared of us." The tenants agreed. Despite the noise and inconvenience, they refused to back down. Instead, they documented the chaos, taking photos and videos of unsafe conditions caused by the rushed repairs. Angela contacted the housing authorities, who sent inspectors to the site, only to find even more violations. Carson's desperation grew with each passing day. The construction costs were piling up, and his attempts to intimidate the tenants had only drawn more attention to his unethical practices. His lawyer warned him that the counterclaims filed by the tenants could result in hefty fines or even legal action. Carson's once unshakable confidence was now replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Then came the final blow. Angela and the tenants had been quietly working on a plan of their own, one that would turn the tables on Carson once and for all. With the help of a local nonprofit that specialized in housing rights, they had managed to secure funding to purchase the building. The offer was finalized and the paperwork was ready. All that was left was to present it to Carson. Angela, flanked by Jamal, Mrs. Lopez, and a representative from the nonprofit, arrived at Carson's office unannounced. Carson looked up from his desk, his expression a mix of shock and anger as they entered. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Angela stepped forward, holding a folder. "It's over, Mr. Carson. We've bought the building." Carson froze, his face draining of color. "That's impossible," he stammered. How could you?" "We had help," Angela said, her voice calm but firm. "People who believe in what we're fighting for. This building isn't yours anymore, Carson. It belongs to us now." Carson's hands trembled as he opened the folder and scanned the documents. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. His power over the tenants was gone. The building he had neglected and abused for years now belonged to the very people he had tried to push out. "You can't do this," Carson said weakly, though he knew it was futile. "We already have," Angela replied. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw not just a tenant, but a force he couldn't control. Carson slumped back in his chair, defeated. Everything he had built, everything he had fought to protect was gone. And Angela Johnson, the woman he had underestimated from the start, had been the one to bring him down. As Angela and the tenants left the office, a sense of triumph filled the air. The fight had been long and difficult, but they had won. The building was theirs, and with it came the opportunity to create a better future, not just for themselves, but for the community as a whole. Carson, meanwhile, sat alone in his office, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. His empire had crumbled, and there was no one to blame but himself. The news of the tenants' victory spread quickly, rippling through the community like a beacon of hope. Headlines praised the perseverance of the residents, with Angela Johnson at the center of it all. Tenants' triumph over greedy landlord, a building saved, a community restored. Read one article, accompanied by a photo of Angela standing proudly with Marcus, Ruth, and several neighbors in front of their building. The story inspired people across the city, proving that unity and determination could overcome even the most entrenched forms of power. The first few weeks of ownership were a whirlwind. Angela and the tenants worked tirelessly with the nonprofit to address the building's many issues. Repairs began in earnest, this time handled by trusted contractors who cared about doing the job right. Peeling walls were painted, leaking pipes were replaced, and the hallways began to shine with a newfound warmth. What had once been a place of neglect and despair was slowly transforming into a safe and welcoming home. Angela found herself stepping into a new role as a leader, not just for her building, but for the wider community. Activists and housing advocates reached out, asking her to share her story at events and workshops. At first, she felt overwhelmed, unsure if she was ready for such a spotlight. But Ruth reminded her of the strength she had shown throughout the fight. "You've already proven what you're capable of," Ruth said one evening as they sat in the living room. "Your voice matters, Angela. Don't be afraid to use it." Encouraged by her mother's words, Angela began speaking at local gatherings, sharing the tenants' journey and advocating for stronger protections against predatory landlords. Her story became a rallying cry for others facing similar struggles, and slowly but surely, a movement began to take shape. One afternoon, as Angela walked through the building, she paused to watch Marcus and some other children playing in the newly repaired courtyard. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and for a moment, Angela felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for this, for Marcus to have a safe and happy home, for Ruth to spend her later years in comfort, and for her neighbors to feel the dignity they deserved. Jamal approached her, holding a clipboard. "We're almost done with the tenant association paperwork," he said, grinning. "Looks like you're stuck with us as president." Angela laughed, shaking her head. "I guess that makes you vice president." "Hey, I'll take it," Jamal said. "But seriously, Angela, we couldn't have done this without you." "We couldn't have done this without each other," Angela replied. "This wasn't just me. This was all of us." As for Carson, the fallout from his defeat was swift and unforgiving. The failed sale of the building had left him in financial ruin, forcing him to sell several of his other properties to cover his losses. Investigations into his neglect uncovered a web of unethical practices, leading to hefty fines and legal battles that further tarnished his reputation. By the time the dust settled, Carson was no longer a prominent figure in real estate, but a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. One evening, Carson passed by the building he had once owned. It looked different now, alive and thriving, with fresh paint and vibrant flowers lining the front steps. He spotted Angela standing by the entrance, chatting with a group of tenants. She didn't notice him, but he paused for a moment, a bitter pang of regret washing over him. For the first time, he realized that his downfall wasn't just a result of their fight. It was his own inability to see the humanity in the people he had tried to oppress. The story of the Johnsons and their neighbors became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, change was possible. Angela often reflected on the journey they had taken, from the despair of receiving that first eviction notice to the triumph of reclaiming their home. It hadn't been easy, and the scars of the battle remained, but it was worth it. As she sat on the newly repaired stoop one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ruth joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Angie," Ruth said softly. "You gave us a home again." Angela smiled, a sense of pride and gratitude swelling in her chest. "We gave ourselves a home, Mom," she replied, "and no one's taken it from us again.